Part of the mystical charm of the British countryside derives from the ominous presence of ancient stone monuments. But are these twisty patterns on medieval stones Celtic, or Viking, or Anglo-Saxon? The answer is yes. I'll explain this later, but let's go back in time to the earliest stone monuments of the Isles. I can only run this channel thanks to the generous contributions of conscientious patrons. I accept several cryptocurrencies and also one-time donations via PayPal, but if you want to get access to exclusive content, then please become a patron on Patreon or Subscribestar. The earliest stone monuments in the British Isles date to the Neolithic. In days gone by, early archaeologists attempted to connect the spiral patterns seen on Neolithic stone monuments in Britain and Ireland with the so-called Celtic artwork of medieval times. In reality, there is no connection at all, and the term Celtic is not appropriate for either. The Neolithic art was made thousands of years before Celts arrived in Britain and Ireland, and the medieval art has little connection to the original Iron Age Celts either. Celtic people in the Isles did create some stone monuments during the Iron Age, such as these wonderful stone heads, which are likely to be idols of their gods. Much later, after the Roman occupation, we can also see some stone monuments to the dead, such as this 6th century stone on Exmoor, which commemorates a man who claimed descent from the Celtic hero Caraticus, who resisted the Roman occupation 500 years earlier. Neither the pre-Roman stone heads nor the post-Roman commemorative monuments display the style of interlaced knotwork which people popularly term Celtic art. In reality, stone monuments in Britain were rare for thousands of years after the end of the Neolithic and the end of the megalith building culture, which finished about 2500 BC. Although some of the Bronze Age bell beaker burials of the following period included stone cists, like this one from Badon in Argyll. The arrival of Celtic languages around 1000 BC did little to change that. In fact, it is the Romans who are responsible for reintroducing public stone monuments. Stelae of these sort are found all over Roman Britain. These ones come from Hadrian's Wall. Some commemorate dead men. Others commemorate entire military regiments. Originally, these stelae would have been painted in bright colours, as shown on these ones from Cirencester, making them less austere, but more striking. Hard to ignore, even after the Romans had left the country. Early medieval stone monuments in Britain are sometimes called Celtic, sometimes Anglo-Saxon, and sometimes Viking. These labels are often used inaccurately, but even when they are used correctly, we must understand that all of them ultimately derive to some extent from Roman artistic traditions, although sometimes in an indirect and roundabout way. Nearly all of the medieval monuments are Christian, yet they also incorporate elements of both Celtic and Germanic pagan beliefs and art styles. This video is going to focus on the pagan elements of these Christian monuments. There are 4 general ethnic categories for the medieval people of the British Isles. 2 are Celtic and 2 are Germanic. The first Celtic one is Brythonic, which includes the Britons of England and Wales, as well as the Picts of Scotland. And the second is Gaelic, which includes the Irish and Gaelic-speaking peoples in the Highlands of Scotland. The first Germanic group are the Anglo-Saxons, who entered Britain in the 5th century, and the second are the Vikings or Norse, who established permanent settlements in Britain and Ireland in the mid-9th century. All of these peoples favoured wood and other perishable materials for their art and building. The shift to stone was gradual and coincided with increasing continental Christian influence on the islands. All 4 groups contributed to the stone monument tradition of early medieval Britain, and they were all influenced by each other. Among the Picts in Scotland, a new artistic tradition emerged in the 6th century of erecting stone stelae incised with cryptic symbols, the meaning of which is lost to us. The same symbols appear on many stones, such as the crescent moon shape or the double discs, which resemble Anglo-Saxon brooches which were worn at the same time. Others resemble the old Roman stelae which were still visible around Hadrian's Wall. However, many symbols are clearly of indigenous and likely pre-Christian significance, such as the boar, which was a holy animal in Celtic mythology. Although boars do feature on some of the Roman stelae. The Knocknagale boar stone from Inverness is thought to have been carved around 600 AD. It too would have once boasted bright, bold colours. The most famous kind of early medieval stone monument in Britain is the High Cross, a large stone cross with ornate carvings which sometimes combine Christian and pre-Christian imagery. It is thought to have derived from earlier traditions using large wooden crosses, themselves derived from even earlier traditions of sacred trees and god poles among the pagans. There is a strong tendency among the general public to call these Celtic crosses because of the interlace knotwork engravings, which resemble the beautiful art in illuminated medieval manuscripts from Britain and Ireland, which were often made by Irish monks. But the oldest examples of high crosses in the region are Anglo-Saxon, not Celtic. One of these is the Ruthwell Cross in southern Scotland, which was part of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria during the 8th century when it was erected. It features images of Jesus and other biblical characters, as well as vine scrolls with birds, which is an artistic motif originating in Roman art. Compare it to this wellhead from medieval Venice. The only thing definitively Germanic about the Ruthwell Cross are the Anglo-Saxon runes. They depict an excerpt from a longer poem called The Dream of the Rood, an animistic reimagining of the crucifixion story told by a conscious, sacred tree from which Christ's cross was to be made. I've already made other videos on that subject. The Bewcastle Cross also has Anglo-Saxon runes on it, and is roughly contemporary with the Ruthwell Cross. This is a cast copy in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The 8th century Acker's Cross from Hexham Abbey is of the same Northumbrian type. On the Isle of Mann, we find some examples of this British-style high cross, but with Viking runes on them rather than Anglo-Saxon runes, and these are influenced by the runestone tradition of Scandinavia. Runes were originally Germanic pagan symbols used in magic and divination, and usually carved on perishable materials like bone and wood. However, the earliest rune stones date to the migration era. Norway's Einung stone dates to the 4th century. Sweden's Møybro runestone to the 5th century, and the Jersberg runestone dates to the 6th century. There are thousands of runestones in Scandinavia, but only very few date to the early medieval times. The vast majority come from the 10th and 11th century, and they include explicitly Christian iconography. The majority, whether pagan or Christian, are commemorative, erected by relatives of the deceased. The Anglo-Saxons did not bring a runestone tradition with them to Britain in the 5th century. They only used runes on small items such as jewellery. So the use of runes in stone monuments like the Ruthwell Cross seems to have been an independent development from the stone-carved runes of Scandinavia. But many Scandinavian runestones include artwork depicting interlaced animals, which are typical of Viking artwork. A similar but older style of interlace was brought to Britain by the Anglo-Saxons centuries before the Vikings though, so it was not a Viking invention. The earliest example of it dates to the migration era and is known as animal style or Salin style I, which evolved into Salin style II in the 6th century, which features ribbon-like animals interlaced in complicated knots. These are considered typical of Germanic art, and they developed on the continent and in Scandinavia. It is thought Germanic people developed this style by combining Roman vine scroll with Scythian animal style art. But in any case, the Germanic interlace style was not the same as anything that came before it. Germanic pagans believed that fate, or as the Anglo-Saxons called it, wyrd, is like a web or a tapestry which is woven or spun by semi-divine female entities, which the Norse called the Norns. The Vikings believed in a kind of feminine magic called seidr, and the word seidr originally referred to a kind of thread like those used in spinning. It is thought that the intricate interlace art of the Germanic pagans reflected their beliefs in the interwoven threads of wyrd. Even after converting to Christianity, the Anglo-Saxons still believed that wyrd governed all things, which might explain why interlace was adopted into Christian art in Britain. There was no interlace art in Britain before the Anglo-Saxons. The Celts adopted interlace from them, and this is why we see similar styles of art in the Book of Kells, for example, which many believe to be Irish. It began as an Anglo-Saxon style, which was developed by both Germanic and Celtic peoples of the British Isles. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the same animal style diverged into the even more intricate animal interlace styles of the Vikings, called ringerike style and urnes style. When the Vikings came to Britain and Ireland, their interlace art blended with the Anglo-Celtic interlace of the locals. This video is sponsored by the Bizarchives.com. Thrilling tales of strange science, heroic ages, and supernatural horror. Fantasy, sci-fi, and cosmic horror literature, both original works and vintage reprints, all available on the Bizarchives.com, Amazon, and most other retailers. The first examples of stone high crosses in the Gaelic world are quite late, from Viking era Ireland. I think that this is the most impressive example. Muradach's high cross from a monastery in County Louth, Ireland, and it's thought to date to the late 9th or early 10th century, with quite clear influence from the Vikings who were in Ireland at the time. The Picts had similar traditions a bit before the Gaels. They combined their native tradition of stone stelae with the Anglo-Saxon high cross tradition to make great works of art like the 8th century Nig stone, a cross on a stone slab surrounded by and composed of Germanic-style interlace combined with Pictish beasts and biblical characters. A Victorian revival of all things termed Celtic saw wealthy people in Britain and Ireland erecting gravestones imitating 9th century high crosses with interlace patterns which they called Celtic. This is why many people call interlace patterns Celtic, but they are really Germanic, Anglo-Saxon in origin, then adopted and developed by Celtic peoples, and then modified again by Viking influence. A local assured me that the Copplestone cross in Devon was Celtic, yet it is dated to the 10th century when the area was thoroughly Anglo-Saxon, and some experts believe the horseman carved on it could indicate Scandinavian influence and thus a later date of the 11th century during the reign of the Viking king Knut. Also in Devon, St Edmund's Church in Dolton boasts a font which is over 1,000 years old. Yet again, the rector assured me it was Celtic. It consists of 2 intricately carved stones which were made separately and joined together later. It is thought they may originally have formed a high cross monument from as early as the 8th century, before being repurposed for their current use. The upper block, in which a square-sided bowl is hollowed, is turned upside down. Why? Some have wondered if the ornament was considered too pagan in nature and needed therefore to be inverted to reduce the threat it posed. On 3 faces of the upper block, the serpent motif appears, interlaced in the Scandinavian style. Some of the interlaced tails have knots at the end, adopted by Christian artists to show that the serpent was in bondage to the cross. The lower block is covered with another variety of interlaced work. The face on the upper part of the south side has animals, most likely dragons, issuing from each nostril like a moustache. The motif resembles both the jewel ravens of Germanic art, associated with the god Woden, and also the more widespread man between 2 beasts motif, which is found in migration-era Germanic art, such as this Anglo-Saxon clasp from Sutton Hoo. The Viking influence on the stone monuments of Britain is most clear in northern England and southern Scotland. Perhaps the most famous and obvious example is the Anglo-Saxon Gosforth cross, which was made in the early 10th century and modifies the by then centuries-old Anglo-Saxon high cross tradition in order to appeal to the Viking immigrants, some of whom were still pagan. The circular cross itself indicates Gaelic influence, but look at some of the engravings. Here we see the dark god Loki bound and tortured by snake venom as punishment for his evil, while his wife Sigyn tries to catch the venom in a bowl. This man, threatened by 2 beasts, is thought to be the god Heimdall, who it is foretold will blow the great Gjallar horn before Ragnarök, the end of the world. Loki's evil child, the great wolf Fenrir, was bound by the gods, but he will break free at Ragnarök and will kill the god Odin. Odin's son, the god Vidar, will avenge his father, stepping on Fenrir's jaw with a special shoe and then tearing his jaws apart before killing him. These scenes all come from Germanic pagan mythology, yet they were all depicted on an obviously Christian monument. Inside St Mary's Church at Gosforth, there is another pagan scene, this one carved on a slab set into the wall of the church itself and thought probably to have come from a high cross like the one outside. Beneath a ringarika-style beast, there is a depiction of the scene from the pagan myth of the god Thor fishing for the great world serpent using the head of an ox as bait. The serpent pulled so hard that Thor's feet pushed through the bottom of the boat and hit the sea floor. He drew up the snake into the boat, but the giant, Humir, got scared and cut the line. Thor then struck Humir with his hammer so that Humir fell overboard. Near to Gosforth, in the town of Penrith, we see more Anglo-Saxon crosses with Norse influence. In the churchyard of St Andrews stands the so-called Giant's Thumb, dated to about 920. Next to it stands the Giant's Grave, which is a collection of 2 Anglian high crosses and 4 so-called Hogbacks graves. Local legend holds that this is the grave of the legendary king Owen Caesarius, who was a Brythonic Cumbrian, yet the monument itself combines Anglo-Saxon and Norse elements. The crosses and the Hogbacks contain both Anglian interlace and scroll, as well as spiral shape suggesting a Celtic influence. The Hogbacks themselves are a uniquely British Viking phenomenon from the 10th to the 12th century, not seen elsewhere in the Viking world except rarely in Ireland. They are named for their shape, but they do not actually represent pigs, rather they resemble a Viking longhouse. The tradition developed in northern England and southern Scotland and is unlike any earlier Norse burial tradition. Despite this, it is widely associated with the Viking settlers and is theorised to represent a grand mead hall, like the Valhall of Viking pagan beliefs, in which elite warriors feast after they die with the great god Odin. These enormous examples of Hogbacks graves are all from Govan in Scotland. Each one was placed on top of a single grave, functioning as a house for the dead. The roofs have beasts integrated into them, likely intended to provide some kind of spiritual protection for the dead. The style of interlace on the lower part of this Hogbacks indicates influence from the Vikings, and dates the stone roughly to the 10th century. However, some other bits look more Celtic. In the same church, we see more evidence of these Celtic-Germanic cultural fusions. The Church of Govan in Glasgow has a huge collection of early medieval stone monuments, all of which came from the churchyard outside. Govan was within the Brythonic, Cumbric-speaking kingdom of Strathclyde, occupied by Britons who were related to the Welsh, but it was influenced by Picts to the northeast, as well as by Gaels and Norse Gaels to the north and the west, and Anglo-Saxons from the east. This monument is called the Sunstone because it has a swastika composed of 4 serpents and is regarded as a solar symbol. Swastikas and triskelions are found in Celtic and Germanic art, including ones made from animals like snakes. Compare it to this triskelion from Ireland, or this one from Sweden. It is believed, based on the rough shape, that this stone was originally a Neolithic standing stone which was repurposed in medieval times. While the serpent swastika seems pagan, the reverse has a clearly Christian crucifix consisting of interlace. The stone itself may originally have been a cross too, but the lateral stone is missing. Beneath the crucifix is a mounted warrior. The Jordan Hill cross next to the Sunstone boasts a more clearly defined mounted warrior of a similar type. This is thought to reflect an influence from Pictish artwork to the north. You can see a clear resemblance to this mounted warrior from the Dublin cross. The rear of the cross is skillfully engraved with interlace patterns. Along the walls of the church are formerly recumbent grave markers which have been stood upright. Some of them boast beautifully carved knotwork, fusing Celtic and Germanic influences. The church even has a medieval sarcophagus. Stone sarcophagi were not used in traditional Celtic or Germanic burials, but they were used in ancient Rome, and the tradition was adapted there after the conversion to Christianity, such that it spread in Europe in a new Christian form. This 4th century sarcophagus from Rome depicts the adoration of the Magi. The one in Govan, dated to the 10th century, has Norse-influenced knotwork alongside a Pictish-style hunting scene. It is believed that it once contained the body of King Constantine II of Scotland, who had close ties with the Norse Gaels of Ireland. No trip to the British Isles is complete without visiting and appreciating some of these fantastic examples of indigenous medieval stone artwork. I hope this little film has whet your appetite to look into this subject in more detail. There's only one place to keep up to date with all of my activities. Not just my latest YouTube videos, which you might not get notified of here on YouTube, but everything I do is all recorded and listed on my Telegram channel. So please follow my Telegram all feed, and you can get updates on archaeology, DNA news, speaking events that I'm attending, discounts on my merchandise, and all kinds of other information all in one place.